بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول رب العالمين وعلى آله الطاهرين ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. Before the break we spoke about the 5 conditions to make a hadith authentic, and then I think after that it's just hadith hasan. What is hadith hasan? So hadith hasan is the hadith below sahih. But if you guys who were here before can remember what hadith hasan was, can you remember hadith hasan? Can you remember hadith hasan? It's the one below sahih. Hasan in the language means good, and it's in terms of in hadith terminology, it's the hadith which is below authentic. So it's still acceptable, but maybe one of the rawis, one of the narrators used to get a lot of mistakes. Right? It wasn't that he was a liar or a fabricator. It was that he would get mistakes, and these are some of the things that make a hadith just below the level of completely authentic. So this is this is in terms of all the people in the chain being reliable. There's a continuous chain. It's free from illah, which I mentioned, where illah was, and it's free from shudud, which we mentioned as well. And this is hadith hasan. So if someone says to you, this is a hasan hadith, means the chain is good, right? And then that's hasan li ghayrihi. So hasan li ghayrihi is when you have narrations which are inauthentic in and of themselves, right? But when you put all the chains together, they give strength to each other, and hence it becomes a stronger hadith. So it's not at the level of authentic, but each of the chains give strength to each other. But obviously this doesn't take place if one of the narrators is a liar. This is if one of the narrators had sort of weak memory and precision. So this is what we call hasan li ghayrihi, and we spoke about this in detail in the previous sessions. So that goes to say, if someone shows you, okay, this hadith is inauthentic, da'if hadith, why are you acting upon it? They don't know all the chains. It could be the fact that there's so many different chains and they all give strength to each other, and hence the level of this hadith increases and it becomes hasan li ghayrihi. Hasan because of another hadith. Hasan means good, so the chain is elevated. Okay, so in terms of acting upon a hadith, there's a few different types acting upon a hadith. One is hadith muhkam, which means it's precise and it's like set in stone, where there's a hadith that you have. For example, the Prophet ﷺ said that don't pray your salah at a particular time, right? Don't pray your salah when the sun is rising, right? This is a hadith of the Messenger ﷺ. But this hadith doesn't have any other hadith that conflict it. So there's not a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said pray during this time, because at times you can have hadith which, when we look at them, they both contradicting each other. So we're going to speak about how the scholars harmonize between them. But first of all, there's this type of hadith which is muhkam, which is a hadith where there's no other hadith that conflicts it. So obviously this hadith is acted upon. The second type of hadith is Mukhtalaf hadith. And so Mukhtalaf hadith is a hadith that looks like it's contradicting, right? It's contradicting another hadith or contradicting the Quran. So how do the scholars deal with these sort of hadith? So there's a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said, La adwa wa la tiyarata, that in Islam there is no spread of disease. Disease doesn't spread. And the Prophet ﷺ also said that we don't take bad omens from birds, right? So we don't take bad omens in Islam. Like, people say, okay, the superstitions that you have, okay, if you walk underneath a ladder, right, this is gonna happen, it's bad. If you walk in the crack in the street, you're gonna break your mum's back. These sort of superstitions that people have. Islam doesn't have these superstitious beliefs. So this is what the Prophet ﷺ said. But in another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said, فِرَّ مِنَ الْمَجْزُومِ فِرَارَكَ مِنَ الْأَسَدِ, that run away from a person who's got majzoom, which is basically when it's an illness where your arms and legs are amputated or falls off. What's the English equivalent to it? Is it leprosy? It says المصاب بالجزام وهو داء تتساقط أعضاء ما يصاب به.
His skin is falling off,
Okay, so leprosy. Run away from the leper as far, فرارك من الأسد, just as you would run away from a lion. But in one hadith, the Prophet said that illness doesn't spread. So how do we understand them? How do we understand these hadith? Which one do we reject? They're both authentic in terms of the transmission. So how do we harmonize between the two? So the scholars mentioned this particular narration is we imply something, that illness doesn't spread except with the permission of Allah, right? And it's in Islam, it's in the Islamic ethos to sort of prevent the spread of disease, right? Because if you stayed with the person you might catch whatever illness he has, right? If the illness can be transmitted, and then you might transmit it to someone else. So that's why you should go away. To prevent the transmission of the disease, you should do that. So these hadith aren't really conflicting if you explain it in that way. So sometimes the hadith, when they conflict each other, like this particular example I mentioned, then there's ways that the scholars approach it. So one of the things, I don't know if it's mentioned here actually. Yeah, it is. So how do the scholars approach it? Now, there's obviously a difference of opinion of how scholars approach it, but generally, Shah Waliullah and majority of the Maliki, Shafi, Hanbali scholars, the Hanafis actually disagreed with how they approach this, but it's generally the same. So first, they'll try to harmonize between the two. Harmonize between the two if it's possible, like they did here. So explain it in a way that you can understand both of them. For example, in the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said, "La salata illa bi fatihatil kitab." There's no prayer except if you read Surah Fatiha. So someone might say, okay, what if you miss Surah Fatiha? What is the consequence? Is Fatiha fard in the prayer? But in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَقْرَأُوا مَا تَيَسَّرَ مِنْ, that read what is easiest for you in the entire Quran. That could be a sentence, that could be any part of the Quran. So the Quran saying one thing in our understanding, and the hadith is saying another thing. So is the hadith going against the Quran? How do we understand the two? Right? Which do we give preference to? It would be the Quran, wouldn't it? But then, of course, you need to read Fatiha in the prayer. So what does this actually mean? The scholars tried to harmonize between the two. It said, okay, Fatiha is not fard, but it's wajib because of the hadith. Right? So they added another kind of tier to it in terms of the hierarchy. So there's hadith that might conflict each other. But the scholarly approach is to first try and harmonize it if it's possible. Then secondly, Secondly, if there's no way to harmonize between the two, then we look at in terms of history, which came first and which came later, right? And this is called Nasikh wal Mansookh, remarriage, time linked. And by the authentic Sunnah, right, mentioned in Sahih al-Bukhari, it was actually made Mansookh. It was abrogated by the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam on the day of Khaybar. He said that nikahul mut'a and eating domesticated donkey was made impermissible at that time, right? But before that it was allowed. But obviously people from different sects of Islam, for example the Shi'i sect, they don't accept this hadith because it doesn't fit their hadith nomenclature, and they would say mut'a wasn't made mansukh, it wasn't abrogated by the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They say it was abrogated by Umar bin Khattab Amirul Mu'mineen radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. But obviously this is not the case. So we have a hadith that abrogated another hadith. So to know that, you have to know the history, right? You have to know the history of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what came first, what came next. So you have to have a timeline, right? And the first person to actually speak about Nasikh and Mansookh, it was mentioned that it was Imam Shafi radiallahu ta'ala anhu. He was asked by one of his students to write a book where he explained the Nasikh and Mansookh and the Mu'awwal, the general things and the specific things, and how to differentiate between them, how to analyze the timeline. He has to have an immense, deep knowledge in this life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. These sort of things Imam Shafi had, and one of his students asked him to write it down. And this was the Risala, which is still studied today, and one of the most important books on the science of Mustalah al-Hadith. So the Risala was a book that was requested by Imam Shafi'i's student, where he was able to tell the abrogated from the abrogation. So what came before and what came afterwards. So Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah, he had a book in this. And another example is the Prophet in the beginning days of Islam, they weren't allowed to visit graves, right? They weren't allowed to visit graves, and the Prophet ﷺ later on told them that you're allowed to visit graves. So how would we know if a hadith is mansukh? If a hadith has been abrogated, how would we know? What do you guys think? So there was one ruling before and one ruling came after. How would we know? I would have given you one.
Rawi.
What?
Look at the Rawi.
What about the Rawi?
As in when he met, obviously, the meeting with Prophet and his age.
Okay, so he said one, look at the person who's narrating it. As in, when did they accept Islam? Did they accept Islam early? Did they accept Islam late? So maybe a narrator of a hadith narrated this particular thing in early Islam. And someone who accepted Islam much after, they narrated the same thing. But then the ruling changed. So it was the final ruling that we will do i'tibar of, and we will consider. So who's narrating it, when they're narrating it, that kind of thing, that's one way of telling it. How else would it? It's kind of obvious if you think about it. How else would we know if something's abrogated and the ruling changed later on in Islam?
When everyone stops doing it.
Yeah, when everyone stops doing it. As in, the companions didn't try. They themselves narrated it, but then they didn't act upon it. For example, they narrated the hadith about talking in the prayer, right? They would talk in the prayer. In early Islam, they were allowed to talk about anything. But later on, when they taught salah to their students, they didn't talk in salah. So they're going against what they narrated. So that's one of the reasons. Another one, the grave thing. Visiting graves.
The grave.
Yeah.
And the Prophet visited his mother's grave and felt sad.
Yeah, but and then after that he said that you're not allowed to visit graves. The Messenger ﷺ himself says that I used to tell you not to do it, now I'm telling you you're allowed to do it. كنت نهيتكم عن زيارة القبور فزاروها فإنها تذكر الآخرة. The Prophet ﷺ himself said, I used to stop you from visiting graves, but now I'm telling you you're allowed to visit graves. So he himself says it. Another thing is when a companion says it, so Jabir radiallahu ta'ala anhu says that the last of the things was that we don't do wudu from things which are touched from the fire, but obviously that's contested. As in, a companion himself says that towards the end of the life of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, this is how we used to do it, and before it was different. So he himself says it. Again, another way of telling it, and this is what Imam Shafi, this is a famous example that they use, that Imam Shafi really knew his timeline of the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He says that, so when he conquered Mecca, it was the 8th year after the Hijrah, 8th year after the migration. Ibn Abbas radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he said that the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself, he on the final year of prophethood, in the 10th year of Hijrah, he went on his one and only Hajj, he went on his lifetime, Hajjatul Wada. In that Hajj, he was in Ihram, and the bloodletting was done to him, right? So Ibn Abbas radiallahu ta'ala anhu saw the Prophet ﷺ do it on the 10th year of Hijrah. Shaddad ibn Awth narrated this hadith after the 8th year of Hijrah. So obviously Ibn Abbas would be the later narration. So this Imam Shafi was able to tell by when they accepted Islam and when the events actually happened, which ruling came afterwards. So the person doing hijama and got hijama done, they won't be muftir, right? They won't have broken their fast. Another way we know is from ijma, consensus of the scholars. For example, there's this hadith about whoever drinks alcohol, then whip them. This is for, obviously, in an Islamic state when they have all the conditions. And if whip them, فَإِنْ عَادَ فِي الرَّابِعَ فَاقْتُلُوهُ. But then if they continuously keep on doing, then you kill them. But ijma said, the consensus of the scholar is that you don't do that. So this shows that this is abrogated, meaning the ruling changed regarding this, right? So this was nasikh and mansukh, and this was when hadith contradict each other, what we prefer. So we look at the timeline when this hadith was actually delivered by the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then another thing we do, we try to harmonize between the two. We try to see which one came forward, one came later. And then the scholars, the third thing that they go to is preference. They prefer this hadith over the other, based on principles that they have. So there's up to 50 principles that they consider when they prefer one hadith over the other. right? And then the final thing that they do, if they can't do all of these, is they act upon both of them. But this is very rare that this happens, where two hadith actually conflict and you go through all of these, you can't harmonize it, you can't understand it by which rule came earlier, which rule came after, and you can't prefer it with the rules that the scholars gave. Then you sort of act upon both of them. Okay, the last thing we'll talk about before we close is the hadith da'if. And this is actually the main thing that people are confused about. When someone says to them, you're praying in a particular way, but this hadith is da'if. They show you the book, look, Sahih al-Bukhari, this hadith is da'if. Why are you praying like that? It's a weak hadith. What does da'if actually mean? Weak. Da'if in the dictionary means opposite of strong, right? Which means weak in the dictionary. But what does weak mean? Does it mean that the Messenger, na'uzubillah, said something that's not correct?
Weak narrations, as in the narrators, you know, there might be a fall in the narrators or something like that. There might be something faulty within it.
That's one of the reasons, right? There might be a fault in the narrations. Ta'an fil rawi. That's one of the two major reasons hadith are weak. Hadith are deemed weak. One is a fault in the rawi, the one who transmits the hadith, right? He might have been known for lying a lot. Or maybe towards the end of his life, like there's a certain scholar, he used to narrate hadith fine from his books, and then towards the end of his life, where his house burned down, and all his books that he used to narrate hadith from, his house, he lost them all in the fire. So then he used to narrate from memory, but he was old at the time, right? Kone. So there's this, I forgot his name, Ibn Lahi'a, I think it was Ibn Lahi'a. His house burned down, right, towards the end of his life, and then he lost all his, so he used to narrate from memory. So all those he used to narrate from memory, later on, he might have been authentic when he transmitted before, but later on when he lost his works, he used to make lots of errors. But they used to transmit from him, his students, and it reached us after all the way, like successively the chain reached us. But again, the scholar of Illah will know that, okay, this guy, whoever took from him after this particular point, then their narrations are in question. So we look at all his students, and we look at who studied with him at what period. So they say, okay, all the hadith narrated by Sufyan, for example, we'll accept. All the hadith narrated by Y scholar, we're not going to accept, because it was after the fire when he narrated this. So one of the major reasons is ta'an fil rawi, a fault in one of the narrators. What do you think the second reason will be? Think about the conditions why a hadith is authentic.
Breaking the chain.
A break in the chain. So saqat min al-isnad. So obviously if there's someone removed from the chain, so someone narrates from the Prophet ﷺ, and then 300 years later someone else picks up on that saying, so-and-so heard the Messenger ﷺ say X, Y, and Z. That is not a complete chain of narration. There's a big gap in there. Hence this hadith will be a da'if hadith. It will be a weak hadith, right? So in terms of a weak hadith, if hadith was weak, I said before, if there were several chains, but maybe, for example, so-and-so narrated from so-and-so, narrated from so-and-so, but then remember his house burnt down, he couldn't narrate, and then there was another chain, maybe his memory became weak, or sometimes he used to lie, right, but a lot of times he used to tell the truth, but maybe he had some hidden agenda, right, and then he just mixed the hadith in. But so many hadith which are all weak, and they're saying the same thing, and these people haven't met each other. So then if that's the case, then they give strength to each other, and it increases the probability of this hadith being more authentic. And this is a hadith that we call hasan li ghayrihi, and it's acceptable. So weak hadith together can be acceptable sometimes. Do you guys get it? So sometimes every hadith which we see, hadith da'if, doesn't mean it's unacceptable all the time. Sometimes when they give strength to each other, it can be made acceptable. And this is what we have to consider when we look at these sort of hadith. When someone's telling you you're praying in a particular way, and they're saying, oh, it's a weak hadith. But how do you know there's not other chains that sort of give strength to each other? And again, hadith is a game, Mustalah al-Hadith is, I said in the beginning of this series, it's a game of probability. As in, a liar, he's not going to lie all the time. Sometimes he maybe can tell the truth. Someone who tells the truth, maybe one time they might lie. It doesn't like take away their credibility. Obviously, if they're known for lying, that's a different thing. But sometimes they might lie here and there, but based on a particular agenda, a particular reason. People pick up on it. Remember, people were really good at transmitting. Everything they would write down, like the guy who came in, they just wrote it down, right? So people would transmit a lot, and they used to preserve it in that sense. But sometimes a lie can tell the truth, sometimes a truthful person can tell a lie. That's why you need illah, and that's why you need to compare and understand it. Is this compatible with the message of the Quran? Is this compatible with other hadith? Right? And this is another level of hadith criticism and hadith analysis. When you look at the chain might be authentic, right? But sometimes they might have misheard even. For example, someone said something, and I might have completely misheard you.